Very often one sort of hurriedly makes the acknowledgments at the end, but I've heard a few talks recently in which the speakers were smart enough to make their acknowledgments at the start, and so I'm simply copying them by saying that my whole career is really based on the fact that I've had a wonderful set of graduate students over time. Many of them have contributed to what I'll be talking about today, and there's one postdoc among them down at the bottom. But you may recognize a few names of very well-known figures now, I'm happy to say, such as Charles Mitter, Fred Gould, Dan Funk you may know, and a number of others. Among them, in fact, this individual right here, who some of you, I think, have some acquaintance with. The herbivorous insects exemplify a number of themes that are of common interest to us all. Okay, so I've spent most of my career studying herbivorous insects, both because, well, they're fascinating in themselves, but they can be used to explore a whole variety of questions, and they have played a very important role, largely through the efforts of others, have played a very important role in exploring a number of problems that, of course, are in no sense unique to herbivorous insects, but are general, such as, for example, ecological specialization and generalization. Very, very conspicuous theme in herbivorous insects, but it applies to every organism, every species on Earth, and it's to understand why some species are ecologically very generalized or physiologically very broadly tolerant and others less so. So that's one of many themes that herbivorous insects have provided very good material for study. I actually got into them via a population genetic question, which was wondering whether herbivorous insects would exemplify multiple niche polymorphism and whether that could be an explanation for the high levels of allozyme heterozygosity that had been revealed by, well, starting with Dick Lewontin. But that led into a familiarization of myself with herbivorous insects as a potentially inexhaustible set of species that could be used for studying all sorts of things. So among them, among the issues that I'll talk about are diversity, host specificity, and phylogenetic conservatism of diet. And two of those are illustrated on this slide. So you may be familiar with cabbage white butterflies and with sulfur butterflies, and you may know that as larvae, cabbage butterflies feed only on some plants in the Brassicaceae, and these sulfur butterflies feed only on certain legumes. But what you may not know is that they represent whole subfamilies in which almost all the species of Peorhini feed on Brassicaceae, and likewise almost all Coleodyne feed on Fabaceae, or other legumes. And these feeding habits go back to at least I think to the late Oligocene. So we're talking about two things. Number one, host specificity, which is very, very common, as we'll see, among herbivorous insects, whereas others, indeed, are very highly generalized. There are other species of butterflies, other species of herbivorous insects generally, which feed on which an individual species will feed on a wide variety of plant families. So why is that the case? Secondly, what we're dealing with is a feeding association, a host association, which has persisted for many millions of years, okay? And in some cases, it even goes back to the beginning of the Cenozoic. So we're talking about just a pronounced pattern of phylogenetic conservatism. And of course, that's an issue which has become more and more prevalent, more and more interesting, as it's been recognized to be very common. Any systematist, of course, will tell you about phylogenetic conservatism. Namely, those are the characters that systematists have used for diagnosing and recognizing whole clades and higher taxa in terms of the phylogenetic conservatism of morphology. But it carries over into ecology as well. Okay. So diversity, herbivorous, given these counts of estimated numbers of living species, herbivorous insects and their host plants account for about 45% of described species of organisms. Okay? So we are talking about immense diversity, I mean, obviously, when all the nematodes and the mites berry and the and bacteria, when all of those have been described, they will dwarf the herbivorous insects in their host plants. But nevertheless, we're talking about huge diversity, and we'd like to know why. Okay. Okay, I thought I'd sort of switch things around, but I guess I hadn't. Okay. Host plant, generalization, and specialization. Here are profiles from Connecticut and Papua New Guinea of the number of Lepidopteran species that seem to be associated with one family of plants in Connecticut or two plant families and so forth. And what you see is the great majority of species of Lepidoptera in Connecticut are associated, found feeding on only a single plant family. Okay? And likewise in Papua New Guinea, somewhat a greater proportion of specialists, but and the same is true if you look at the number of species of plants that are in an insect's diet. You find a preponderance of insect species, in this case feeding on only a single plant species. So this is something you'd like to know. Well, actually the first plot of this kind that I'm aware of having been published was published by me in 1979. And this is based on a study that I did rather soon after leaving graduate school, when I still thought that I could be an ecologist. This work convinced me that ecology is much too hard, and I've never really done it again. And so I spent a summer in a hardwood forest in the Hudson Valley of New York, collecting Lepidoptera, sampling Lepidoptera larvae from every species of woody plant in that forest, because I just wanted to see a portrait of what that association would look like. I mean, you can go to the literature to look at what's known about the degree of host specificity of various species of moths and butterflies, but how does that actually play out in a local community? Okay? To what extent is the fauna of your average tree species dominated by specialist versus generalist species? To what extent are the specialists more or less common than the generalists? In other words, what does that interface between trophic levels look like? It's, in some sense, a picture of part of the food web, right? And this was actually the first such study done. And lo and behold, what did we find? Well, here's that same kind of distribution of the number of apparent species we found. This is, a highly flawed study, but it was the first. And basically, that's the same frequency distribution that we just saw. For the various tree and shrub species that we looked at varied tremendously in whether numerically the total insect density, but they varied in total insect density, and also in the proportion of specialists and oligophages and generalists. Well, astonishingly, and then the next thing we looked at that I was interested in was knowing that very often an insect will feed on a number of related plant species. I wanted to see whether this would be reflected in the faunal similarity of different plants. Would related plants tend to have more similar insect faunas than more distantly related plants? Well, at that time, there was no plant phylogeny. And so the best surrogate that one could use was plant classification. And so here we have all the tree species, or all the woody plant species, and this is a phonetic diagram showing the degree of similarity of their insect fauna. And what I pointed out was, well, we seem to have cases in which you have plants with fairly similar faunas are in the same plant family, for example, right here, or at least in the same plant order right there. And so this hinted at the possibility that, again, at the local level, you would find some kind of faunal similarity, shared faunas among plant species as a function of their phylogenetic proximity. Okay. Well, to my astonishment, this paper is still cited with surprisingly high frequency, because since then there have been other studies far better, far more comprehensive of this kind. And so I'll just mention two of them. I think actually all of them have been done in the tropics. So this is a work of a massive, massive study in Papua New Guinea by Novotny and his colleagues. And here's another massive study in the Panamanian rainforest. And what's plotted here again is the community similarity of insects shared between plants as a function here of their phylogenetic distance, because now we do have plant phylogenies. And indeed, you find the same pattern that the more phylogenetically proximate plant species are, the more similar their insect faunas. And the same holds true in Panama, where here again taxonomy is being used as a surrogate for phylogeny. So this suggests that there's a very important historical component in the association of insects that you find associated with any one plant species, and in sort of the organization of that among plant species in a community. And the same is true, for example, here's another exercise in which I looked at all there are many genera of leaf beetles, CHRYSOMELIDAE, in which there are species found in New York State, and congeneric species that are found in other regions of the world. Okay? And I asked, if I know what plant family a beetle feeds on in New York, can I predict that it will be eating, essentially, that its congeners, to what extent are they likely to be eating the same plant family in Europe, or in tropical America, or in Western North America? And the answer is that there's an enormous match. So here, for example, there are 16 genera of chrysomelids in New York State that are also found in Europe, and which are associated with a single host plant family in New York. Okay? In 15 of those cases, it's the same family that is being used in Europe. Okay? And likewise here for Western North America, 11 out of the 15 genera that are shared between New York and Western North America are feeding on the same plant family, and so forth. And this is what you get if you look for things that, species that, genera that feed on 2 plant families in New York. 9 out of 9 cases, the European congeners feed on at least one of those 2 same plant families. And I draw from this the inference. Now, I don't know whether the colonization was from Europe to northeastern North America or vice versa, but what's important is that whenever that colonization took place, in whichever direction it was in, these beetles basically fit into the community that invaded, because they found there host plants that they were already in large part pre-adapted to. Okay? That they're close enough to their to what they have historically fed on. And this suggests to me that this aspect of the organization of a community, understanding the structure of this interface between trophic levels, in large part has a deep, deep historical basis. Okay? As we're here looking at the consequence of past evolution, and I don't just mean since the Pleistocene or since the Pliocene, but going much further back in time. And so this is one manifestation, one aspect of ways in which community ecologists generally have been recognized the importance of history, the importance of deep evolutionary history for really understanding the structure and dynamics of communities. So that's theme 1. Whoops, here we are. Here's theme 2. So we have all these specialized insects. Why specialize? It would seem as if the obvious disadvantage of specialization is if a population, or individuals for that matter, do not have access to the resource to which they are best adapted, that their fitness is going to be very low, or like 0. And that must be the case in the history of really every species. And so there are, and here's the particular kind of rub. Imagine a case, here you have an ancestral species of insect which is associated with plant A, and it speciates, and perhaps one of the species retains that ancestral association, but the sister species switches to plant B. Why does it abandon plant A, to which it's already adapted? So this is the conundrum. And here's an example right here. I'll refer to these chrysomelid beetles in the genus Ophraella again, and every one of these species is in this case, everyone is associated with a different genus of plants in this case. Okay, and we know they have common ancestors, so there have been not host range extensions, but switches. So the question is, how do we account for the evolution of specialization? And I list here 5 hypotheses. And 2 of them I'm not going to talk about, And that's the possible role of interspecific competition. And another is the possible role of predators and specializing in a plant because it provides enemy-free escape space. What I will talk about are the three other ideas. And the most prevalent by far, the most prevalent idea by far, because of course it's rampant throughout evolutionary ecology, is the notion of trade-offs, the notion that there's no such thing as a free lunch, that adaptation to one circumstance, one resource, one habitat comes at some kind of cost, and very often the cost is the degree of fitness or adaptation to another habitat or resource. And so the whole notion here now, historically, thinking about herbivorous insects has been dominated even for almost the entire history of thought, has been dominated by the idea that plants have diverse secondary chemicals that act as repellents and act as poisons, they act as defenses. And the whole notion then is that adaptation of herbivorous insects to host plants is very largely a matter of adaptation to the peculiar chemistry of a group of plants, or perhaps even a single species of plants. And then, so the notion then is, if you feed if you feed insects different kinds of plants, there's likely to be a trade-off in their capacity to digest, to tolerate the poisons, to metabolize the toxins or whatever of different plants, and there'll be some kind of a trade-off then in physiology as a function of differences between the plants in their chemistry or perhaps their morphology. So let's explore this question. And there are a couple of ways of exploring this. In other words, we need to test for trade-offs. And one way in which this is sometimes done is to compare related species and look at their performance on resource 1 versus 2. And we look here at two species which normally are found on one or the other. So here's a species which is native to, which normally feeds on plant 2. And it is expected to have a lower fitness on plant 1, and vice versa for the insect species that normally feeds on plant 1 if you test it on plant 2. And if you see a pattern of fitness or performance, growth, survival that looks like this, you say you have evidence for a trade-off. If you don't see that pattern, then you have no evidence for a trade-off. The problem is, while I think certain things can be learned by comparing species, the problem here is that you expect this for reasons that have nothing whatever to do with trade-offs. Okay? So here is species 1, and we're saying it doesn't do very well if you put it on species 2. Let's suppose that the direction of evolution has been the ancestor fed on resource 1 and the descendant feeds on 2. So species 1, we put it on the descendant's host plant, which this species has never encountered before, so why should you expect it to do well on plant 2? You don't. And species 2, meanwhile, has been adapting to resource 1, but there's no reason why it should retain adaptation to species. It's well adapted to its host plant 2, but there's no reason it should retain adaptation to plant 1. And it could lose that adaptation for any of several reasons, one being that there's a trade-off, or one being that the particular characters, the particular genes that underlie characters that are necessary to use this resource may simply degenerate by mutation and genetic drift if there's no selection maintaining them. And I'm going to come back to that idea. So it's not really a good test, but nevertheless, it's interesting to ask what you find when you do compare closely related species that are associated with different host plants, or in this case, compare a generalist species and a closely related specialist. And the expectation would be, if the trade-off hypothesis is that if you feed them both the host plant of the specialist, that the specialist should be better in some sense, okay? And measurements of better that are often taken have been the larval weight gain per amount of food ingested, some measure of the effectiveness or efficiency of processing that food. And another measure is taking into account the amount of the ingested food which is actually assimilated, which is ingested food minus the fecal output, and looking then at the larval weight gain per amount of assimilated food. And so we did this long ago with these two species of tent caterpillars. The distria is very much more of a generalist. The larvae feed on several plant families, including the Rosaceae, and including black cherry, for example. which is the predominant host plant of the eastern tent caterpillar, with which I'm sure you are all familiar. And so we reared these and did, and measured these functions, these efficiency measures for Distria and Americana, and these are the numbers we got out, and they are about as close to identical as you could reasonably expect them to be. There was not a hint of greater efficiency on the part of the specialist when both of them are fed the specialist's host plant. Okay. Now, I should say that the specialist does sometimes use other plants, especially other rosaceous plants, when it exhausts the foliage on its host, but by and large it doesn't do that very much. Here's another example. These are two of these Ophraella beetles, in which we have, and this one feeds, in fact, this one I described, I called it Ophraella slobodkini, and it feeds on ambrosia, common ragweed. Its very close relative feeds on notiolata, feeds on this salt marsh plant, which is related to ambrosia. Okay? We have reason to think from the phylogeny and the distribution of these plants that ambrosia is almost surely the ancestral host. Okay? And so we reared both species on both host plants and looked again at the weight gain of larvae. And that's what you see, the weight gain in relation to the amount of dry, of tissue, leaf tissue consumed. So here's the ambrosia feeder feeding on ambrosia, and indeed it has high efficiency. If we take that ambrosia feeder and we put it on the derived host, the salt marsh plant, we find that it has lower efficiency and, in fact, very, very poor survival. If we take the species that normally feeds on this salt marsh plant, which we think is the derived host, okay, then what we see is, well, it's better adapted to the salt marsh plant than the ambrosia feeder is, and that's certainly reassuring. But when we put the beetle from this plant back on the ancestral host, plant, ambrosia, we find that its assimilation efficiency is identical to that of the ragweed feeder, which is adapted to that plant. So in other words, this would seem to imply that adaptation to this plant occurred in Ophraella notiolata, but that did not require loss of fitness on the ancestral host. Again, no suggestion of evidence of a trade-off. Well, we can go further. I think that if you're going to test for trade-offs, you should do this by looking at different genotypes within populations, because that is where the locus of adaptation and trade-off is going to actually occur during the process of evolution of host use. Okay? And so what you really want to look at is the fitness of different genotypes on these two different host plants, and ask if there's some kind of a crossing pattern which would be manifested as a negative genetic correlation. I hope most of you know what genetic correlations are. And whereas in this case you would have a non-significant or positive genetic correlation, which would be the antithesis of a trade-off. That would simply say some genotypes are better than others no matter what plant you put them on. Okay? Well, in the course of, I told you I was motivated originally to study herbivorous insects because of the idea that there might be different genotypes associated with different host plants within a species, maintaining polymorphism. And we found that, but we found it in only one of nine species of geometric moths that we looked at. And that was this one. So here I'm talking about some pretty ancient history. This is the fall cankerworm, a very polyphagous species. It feeds on many plants. Okay, this is the male. This is a female. They come out at this time of year. That's why it's called fall cankerworm. They're wingless females. They lay eggs. The larvae, when they hatch, can disperse by wind. They balloon on silk. And here's a larva. And it was very abundant back in the 70s on Long Island. And what we discovered by electrophoresis was that although there are sexually reproducing females which produce some male progeny, okay, there also is the predominance of most of the population is made up of parthenogenetically reproducing females, okay, in which all of the offspring have the same heterozygous electrophoretic profile as their parent, as their mother. And this meant, and we also believe that these are continually springing up from the sexual population. I won't go into that. And so this provided an opportunity to rear individual genotypes across different plants, okay, because you had carbon copies of the same genotype. And so that's what we did with a number of different genotypes. And this is what, and we did this both in the laboratory in dishes where we would, feed them plants, each of a number of different species of plants, 4 different plants. And we also did it in the field by caging larvae on branches of the different host plants. And this is what we found. And above and so these are the correlations in the weight gain of 9 or 10 different genotypes, depending on whether it was done in the lab or in the field. And these are the correlations in their performance across 4 different plants, 3 of them in one family and 1 in a different family. And what you see is that there's not a negative correlation there. There's not a single negative genetic correlation to be found. In fact, many of them are positive. And so this said, there is not a hint, again, not a hint of evidence of a genetic trade-off. And you can say, well, this is one study, and it's just a small number of genotypes, and it certainly is not the last word on it. Well, since then, there have been many, many other words, okay? There have been lots of studies of this kind on a whole variety of insects. There are a few cases in which evidence of a trade-off was found. For example, this species of aphid on a few correlations. But all kinds of studies of other aphids, of true bugs, of a variety of beetles, a variety of Lepidoptera, this study of a leaf-mining fly, and many others. And the results are summarized in this recent review paper in Ecology by Matt Forrester, who was my postdoc, and others. And the consensus is we cannot find any evidence from genetic variation within populations of a trade-off, that genotypes that are superior on one host are inferior on others. So there may well be trade-offs, but it looks as if they don't necessarily lie in how insects are processing leaf material. Okay. Here's one possible trade-off. In Alsophila, we found that certain of those genotypes were more prevalent in stands of oak and others in stands of maple. And what we found was that the hatching of the larvae matched the difference in the phenology of the host, of bud break of maples versus oaks. Again, one data point only, really, but it does raise the possibility that that timing of the life cycle relative to the timing, the phenology of host plants, is an area where there could be a trade-off. And in a way, it's almost necessarily a trade-off because you can only hatch once. And so the temporal trade-offs are indeed quite likely. Another kind of trade-off was suggested long ago by Levins and MacArthur, and then developed more recently by Elizabeth Bernays, who recently retired from the University of Arizona, who's an insect behaviorist and one of the most brilliant experimenters I've ever known. She can conceive experiments, left and right, and they're just absolutely wonderful. And so she and Bill Wislow developed the idea further that there may be limitations in the capacity of brains to process information. Okay? And the whole idea being that being faced with fewer choices is, it results in faster information processing and faster decision making than having to make a decision about, are any of these 10 items edible versus any of those 10 items that are, is this one of the 10 edible items versus the 30 inedible items? Or can I simply make a binary choice? It's either this species or all others. Okay? And that was the general idea, that perhaps there'd be this kind of superiority in information processing. And my former student Dan Funk did a postdoc in Arizona, and he and Liz got together to study this species of aphid, which in eastern North America is a specialist on ragweed, studied by Nancy Moran here when she was a graduate student here many years ago. But in western United States, it is a generalist. It feeds on a variety of different genera of composites. And so what they did was to compare eastern and western populations by putting the host plant, ambrosia, which all of them will use, embedding ragweed plants in mixed bouquets of other kinds of plants, and basically ask how quickly, how long does it take until you see aphids that have actually been able to reach the phloem, to find the host plant and penetrate it with their stylets and start feeding? And the answer in each of these several combinations of other plants with the ambrosia was that the easterners found the phloem faster. And furthermore, easterners, between the time they actually contact the plant and the time they actually get their stylets in place and start sucking phloem, is faster for the Easterner. And since then, there have been one or two other studies suggesting that maybe there is something to this notion of sensory and information processing limitations. But finally, I want to raise the possibility that I mentioned earlier, that maybe when you get a switch from one host to another, it's just because you're dealing with a population that simply in which the ancestral host is in a place where, well, the ancestral host is just not very abundant. And the adoption of a new host may be because that new plant is very abundant. But if the ancestral host is not very abundant, then what can kick in is the demography of selection. And here there's a critical paper by Bob Holt and Michael Gaines, in which they point out that if you have adaptation to two different resources, one is rare and the other is common, there's selection for increased fitness on both of them, but the contribution to the next generation is necessarily numerically greater from the more abundant host, or the more abundant resource, than from the less abundant host. And the consequence of that is that it's a given fitness increment on being able to feed better on the abundant host and better to feed better on the less abundant host, that the mutation which enhances fitness to the same degree on the abundant resources or host plant is going to increase in frequency more rapidly. So here you see this idea that, that mean fitness is increasing on both the common and the rare host, but it's increasing faster on the common host. And if that's the case, they ask, well, if you were a female insect, where would you best put your eggs? Well, your larvae are likely to be fitter on the more common host than on the rare host, and therefore there will be generated selection for a more specialized choice of diet. Okay? And I think that's a brilliant idea, and there's been almost no work on it at all. Okay? If you want to get into some interesting issues in evolutionary ecology, I think this is one that really is worth following through on. Related to this is the extreme case in which the rare host is so rare that it isn't there at all, and this is what I referred to earlier. In that case, there's no selection for maintaining the capacity to recognize and handle the rare host, which is now simply not there. And mutations which cause a degeneration of that capability become selectively neutral and can be fixed by genetic drift. Well, we certainly know that if you look at allopatric populations of plants, such as this beetle studied by my student Dan Funk, we know that if you look at populations of plants that are associated with different host plants in different regions, where the other population's host plant is very rare or absent, what you'll find is indeed local adaptation to the common host plant. And in this case, which do they choose? Well, if you're looking with an Oklahoma population that feeds on betula, birch, and you give them both birch and maple leaves, basically they all choose birch. Okay? And likewise for the maple-associated populations, they all choose maple. And you ask, well, why would they do that? Okay, it's not as if they were being penalized for going on to birch, because they never encounter birch, but rather there seems to be, possibly just the loss of the capacity to use a host plant that their common ancestor may have utilized. So but this remains a largely unexplored hypothesis, and it really is at the level of hypothesis without data. How am I doing on time? Well, I have a lot more to cover in not very much time. What accounts for the conservatism of host use? Okay. This is, again, I think this is a really intriguing question. And one obvious hypothesis, so the question is, why do you have whole clades of butterflies associated with a single plant family for, ever since the Miocene or the late Oligocene or even more? And one is, you could say, well, in some sense, there's stabilizing selection, and it's selection against transferring, any other kind of host plant. And that may be true, and it may be very difficult to distinguish from ideas of genetic constraints. Genetic constraint is something, it's kind of a bad word if you talk to many population geneticists. They really don't want to believe in it, but I don't, except for this one. They believe that genetic correlations among traits can indeed act as constraints under some circumstances. But I think we should also entertain the possibility that for complex ecological characteristics, it could be the case in some instances that the genetic variation just isn't there, or is not, or is not selectable, which is a difference. And then thirdly, and this is something I have nothing to say about, it may well be that shifting to a new host sometimes involves just simultaneous changes in too many characters. It's the whole issue of how do you get the evolution of new complex characteristics that are all, where you have a number of functionally interdependent components. Well, I have something to say from personal experience only about the first of these, and that is raising the real possibility that levels of genetic variation in key traits might contribute to the failure to adapt to different plants. So here is Ophraella once again. The various species of Ophraella feed on plants in 4 different tribes of the Asteraceae, the Compositae. And the first step in this study was to do my best to assess the phylogenetic history of host shifts in the group. And this was based on allozymes first and then mitochondrial DNA, and so you can tell I haven't done anything for a long time along this line. And so here in the different shadings in this very ancient slide represents the four different host tribes. And you can see that there is a preponderance of species retaining their association with the same host tribe. For example, here are 3 species that retain an association with the Asteraceae. Okay? Here, incidentally, each species is connected by arrows to its host plants, and this is a highly reduced phylogeny of the Asteraceae, of the relevant Asteraceae from Bob Jansen's work. And there's very little correspondence between the plant and insect phylogenies, which is what you expect. So then the big question was, does each of these species have the genetic potential for adapting to any host plant that any plant that you challenge it with? Okay. Out of all the plants in the world, what shall we challenge a ragweed feeding beetle with? And the best thing is let's challenge it with goldenrod or something that's fed on by other species of Ophraella, because we at least know it is possible for Ophraella sometime in its evolutionary history to have made that, to have adapted to that plant. And so in this case, and so we look basically screening for genetic variants in some character that relates to the ability to use a challenging plant. And the characters in question were larval survival and how much the larva will eat if you give it leaf tissue from a particular species of plant. And then after that, how much an adult will eat. Okay, and these are all naive larvae, naive adults. And the idea is you mate each of a number of males to 2 or more females. From each female, you get a number of progeny. You split these progeny over different plants. If you want to, here are two challenging plants, plant A and plant B. And you ask if there's any significant variance among progeny from different sires. And just to be generous and very broad in our conception of genetic variance, we also will allow variance of progeny of different mothers to count as evidence for genetic variation. And the results of this was, well, the results were that I had 39, well, let me just say, with respect to survival, out of something like 39 comparisons, so that's 4 species of beetles against 4 or 5 species of plants, looking at both adults and larvae. Okay? In the case of the larvae, survival, we found genetic variation in only 2 combinations. Okay? And that was basically the ability to survive on a closely related host plant within the same tribe. Okay? In all other cases, we found very often complete mortality. So, and even when the mortality wasn't complete, no evidence of genetic variation. With respect to feeding response, this is what we found. We have 39 comparisons, and let's simply ask, did we find any evidence for genetic variance, yes or no? Okay? And here, and this is, as I say, feeding response, and that as a function of whether the test plant is in the same tribe as the beetle's normal host plant, or whether it was in a different tribe of that plant family. And first of all, in almost half the cases, we did not detect genetic variance. Okay? In this, first of all, and this is a case where I think a negative is interesting. Okay? And it's because the experience of evolutionary geneticists has been that if you look for genetic variance in a character, you usually find it. Okay? which then carries through into the supposition that almost any characteristic will evolve under natural selection very quickly. Every species of beetle showed genetic variance in some, in some responses. So they weren't like too inbred. But nevertheless, we have many cases in which we don't find evidence of genetic variance. Secondly, there's at least a strong hint of an association of genetic variance with the test plant being in the same tribe rather than a different tribe of where we have more negative cases if we test the beetle on a different tribe of plant than its normal host. Well, this is clearly just a hint of what might be done. But the critical point here is instead of looking for variation, genetic variation, in a feature that you know is likely to adapt rapidly, or is found to have changed in another closely related population or whatever, ask yourself, do populations have the genetic variation that would be necessary to adapt to some really novel challenge? Whether the novel, and the novel challenge could be new plant. The novel challenge could be change in climate, for example. Could be change in ocean acidity. What's the genetic variance for the capacity in shell-building marine organisms to adapt to pH changes? Okay. So the conclusion of this study were that, as basically what I just said, that each species showed some genetic variation, but that the genetically variable responses were more often elicited by plants that are closely related to the normal host, which certainly fits then into the macroevolutionary pattern. Again, a possible connection between microevolution and macroevolution fits into the macroevolutionary pattern of the frequent pattern of adapting to closely related host plants rather than, say, plants in different families. I think I am going to stop there. The last module is why are phytophagous insects so diverse? The answer is, well, something about herbivory really does seem to increase diversification rate. This is Charlie Mitter's very famous introduction of the idea of replicated sister group comparisons to test for the effect of a character on diversification. And then there's the question of the degree to which adaptation to different hosts actually causes speciation to happen. And this would be an instance of ecological speciation, the idea that divergent adaptation brings about somehow the evolution of reproductive isolation. And in the case of herbivorous insects, we do have such cases, most famously the apple maggot fruit fly, but also Dan Funk's work on Neoclimyces and Patrick Nozzle's work on these lovely stick insects. But so there are hints and there are things going on having to do with trying to understand why herbivorous insects are so diverse. But I think it's time for me to just really come to a conclusion. And the conclusions really are not conclusions, they're questions. Okay? Everything I've talked about, we just have just the barest glimmering of an answer to a really pretty big question. Okay? And so, let's go back to the start. I'm suggesting that deep evolutionary history can have played is part of our understanding of why a local community has the species composition and the particular linkages that it has. Okay, at least with respect to herbivorous insects, probably with respect to a lot of parasites and so on. Well, what's the role? How do we understand the role of deep evolutionary history compared to very rapid recent adaptation, compared to kind of assembly rules based on pure ecological processes? What are the roles of those in understanding what we're looking at when we look at a community or a food web? Second, why specialized? To what extent does competition between species drive specialization in herbivorous insects? We have not a clue. Totally neglected. Okay. For other animals, it's not been neglected, but for insects, it has been. What's the role of predation in selecting for the use of host plants that provide some kind of protection against predators? Our functional trade, what kind of functional trade-offs really may operate? I've touched on a couple of possible ones, but not the ones that we thought might be obvious. And to what extent is mutational decay important in this evolution? And then, and then finally, what is, in what context may a limitation on genetic variation really affect the rate of adaptation, the rate of speciation, in one way or another, to retard it, to bias the direction of evolution, or possibly constrain it altogether? These are great big open questions, and I can't answer them, but maybe some of you can. Thank you very much for inviting me and for your attention.
All right, there's time for questions.
I actually finished more or less on time.
So
Dan.
at least one of your models for the evolution of specialization and host switching has to do with essentially species gravitating towards, or selection driving species towards whatever host species is becoming locally most abundant, right? So I'm wondering if you have any comments on how that might export to really diverse tropical communities, because at least the perception there is that you have extreme host specialization plus extreme rarity. So
Yeah.
sort of odds of
Yeah.
thinking about particular host species
Wow.
drifting to that level of abundance.
That's a phenomenally good question that I haven't thought of, and maybe it suggests that maybe this is not necessarily all that important a role. I think in tropical systems, I think there have been some studies that I think at least hint at the possibility of protection against predators, this predator escape hypothesis, as a reasonable one. But I think that's a really good question. On the other hand, while we have the notion that if you walk into a tropical rainforest, there are, well, Chris, you correct me on this. We have this notion there are 200 or 300, tree species, and they're all really rare. Well, the reality is in most forests, there are going to be a few species that are reasonably common. Yeah, lots and lots of rare ones, but a few usually are reasonably common. And if that varied from one place to another, then I think we could still get this effect. But Chris, you're going to have a lot more to say about that than I do.
Well, the other thing I would say that specialization is often at the level of genus, and at the genus level, things are not so rare.
Yeah, no, yep, yeah. And I don't know if you heard what Chris said, but he said specialization often is not at the level of individual species of plants, but genus, as I indicated. And that's a really important point. Right. I should think so. I haven't thought about metapopulations, not in this context anyway. And a lot of it would have to do with the dispersal capacities of the species, wouldn't it? It really would, because otherwise you could certainly envision the formation of lots of local populations that may be adapting to different plants. So the role of gene flow is enormously important in this and a lot of other contexts as well. Catherine.
You mentioned earlier at the beginning of your talk that some of these associations go back to the zoologist team, and what exactly is the evidence for that?
The phylogenetic evidence. Okay, so you take, say, Heliconia and butterflies, and they're all feeding on Passifloraceae, and so you basically, you ask, well, if you have any remotely well-calibrated rate of sequence evolution, then you can see it from that. And this has been clear for a very long time. And in some, well, I don't doubt that. And Nancy Moran she had a paper on an aphid which has exactly the same, it has an alternating life cycle as many aphids do between two different plants in different times of the year. And that same alteration is found in an American species and an Asian species, and in that case, it was really old. I mean, when I said early Cenozoic, I think she was dating it to almost the beginning of the Cenozoic, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
One of my thesis is kind of study ecosystems and particularly bees and the flowers they pollinate. And I was thinking about the reasons for specialization that you offered for herbivores, and it seemed a lot of them, I think, would be at least transferable to a mutualistic behavior between a pollinator and a pollinated flower. And in the tropics, there's a lot of evidence for specialization in bees, but But as you move to the temperate zone north or south, a lot of the bees become generalists.
Yeah.
And that pattern kind of breaks.
Right.
I was curious if you have any thoughts about that.
This, yeah, well, so the question was, the observation is that in bees you have a lot more pollination specialists, that is oligolectic bees, compared to more polylectic bees that are in these latitudes, which is, of course, there's been another whole line of thinking, way back from like when I was a graduate student, about how the tropics are supposed to be constant and so forth, and allow the evolution of increased specialization, which otherwise might be disadvantageous in the supposedly more inconstant northern latitudes, as resources might fluctuate more and more. And so I guess the question is there anything to that hypothesis or not? Because if it were true, then we go back to really classic community ecology, way back to the 60s, in thinking then in terms of basically species dividing up niche space, right? And in the case of pollinators, I can certainly see that would be very likely. We know there's competition among pollinators, right? And so it could well be that competition is playing an important role there. What I think is more questionable is this whole notion that the constant tropics, and I think there are people here who would agree with me that is perhaps a myth. But I'm prepared perfectly to believe that competition plays a role there. I emphasize that in the case of like folivorous insects that are eating leaves or sapsuckers or whatever, there is almost no study that I'm aware of, and if I'm wrong, please tell me, of just ecological studies of the kind that really would show that competition plays an important role that might drive the evolution of specialization. It's really, it's been neglected ever since the famous paper in 1960 by Harston Smith and Slobodkin, right, who said, oh, herbivores, the world is green, they don't compete. So which I think we all snicker at, but maybe that's ramified down through the decades, whatever. Any other?
Thinking about the importance of having an abundant host in making host switches, have you thought about this in terms of the agricultural system? That seems like that'd be a pretty good system to study that.
No, I've thought of it in the sense that this seems like exactly the place to look for that, where if you have monocultures of some crop over vast areas, you would expect exactly that. And I'm not aware of anyone who's really pursued that line. But obviously people have studied adaptation of insects to crops. We certainly know that's happening. In fact, like in the sulfur butterflies that I started with, we know about adaptation to alfalfa, for example. But what I don't know is whether there's been carry-through. I'm not aware that there's been carry-through to ask whether this seems to have any consequences for the ability to use other plants. But that's a really good point. And there are people in this room who I can imagine doing that. And when you do, let me know. Yeah,
Well, isn't the example that you mentioned close to talk with the Ragolitas?
the Ragolitas. And so the Ragolitas, so this is the famous apple maggot, and it's the poster child for sympatric speciation, which actually Jeff Feeder admits isn't totally sympatric, but anyway. So here you have this adoption of apple as a host starting in the 1870s or so, at least the first records, and the formation of two host races. Okay, and the critical point there, which Guy Bush recognized, it was Guy Bush who set this off, with his observation that it looked as if their phenology was offset, because it's the ripening time of the fruits and the time at which they have to go into diapause. So this was